Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to those of you who may be in Japan. So thank you for joining our webinar, part of the Japan program of Fondation for Strategic Research in Paris. And we will focus in this webinar on how Japan views the EU increasing engagement in terms of security in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. And we will try to build a kind of dialogue between our two speakers on this issue. We have two speakers. The first one is Tsuyoshi Goroku. He's a lecturer at the Nishogakusha University in Tokyo. And Frédéric Grare, who is Senior Research Fellow at the European Center of Foreign Relations, but who was formerly in charge of Indo-Pacific at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, CAPS. I don't know how you, what is the acronym in English?
Oh, this is basically policy planning.
Yeah, policy planning. Yes, sorry, I'm very bad with all these acronyms. You see, I never part of any institutional organization in that. So just to sum up and launch the discussion, last year the EU published its strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. It was the first, and this strategy came 3 years after the French own Indo-Pacific strategy that was published in 2018. And as was mentioned before, offline 2021 also saw an increased military activities in the Indo-Pacific and particularly on the Asian Pacific Asian side by EU member states in the region. France had a few missions in the region as a Pacific power that it claims to be, that it is, but also Germany, and it was a first for Germany. And this is, all these activities and this new strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy, are in line with Japan's own free and open Indo-Pacific concept that was launched in 2007 by former Prime Minister Abe, and also in line with a constant support from Japan to this increased interest and engagement in the region by EU and European member states, with, of course, China in mind. And on China, indeed, there is also a convergence of perception and analysis between Japan and the EU or EU member states, thanks largely to China's own more assertive or aggressive posture in its own region, but also beyond the region itself. But there are also debates, and I think we will go a little bit deeper into these debates, both inside Europe and in Asia, particularly Japan, about what role can the EU play in terms of defense and security that would add value to what the US, the most important security purveyor in the region, is already giving. So without more delay, I will give the floor first to Tsuyoshi Goroku for about 15 minutes, and then to Frédéric Grare for the same length of time. And after that, we will have a Q&A session. Please use the button Q&A to ask your question, and I will relay them after the two presentations. And the webinar is for 1 hour. It will finish at 10 o'clock French time, 6 Japan time. Thank you very much. So now, please, Tsuyoshi Goroku, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Niquet-san, for kind introduction. And I also thank Team FRS for organizing this important seminar. I'm Tsuyoshi Goroku, a lecturer at the Nishogakusha University in Tokyo. I wish I could have been my second home, Paris, but still I'm very pleased to be here to discuss such a timely issues with you. Today, because of my background, I'd like to focus more on how Japan's view the growing military presence of Europe in general in the Indo-Pacific region. In my presentation, I would like to address three questions. The first is why recently Japan and European countries has been promoting and expanding security and defense cooperation in this region. The second one is what's the Japan's view on growing European military engagement. And the third is what is the challenge for future. First of all, let me explain what is the strategic calculation of Japan's security cooperation with Europe and the reason why Europe has engaged more actively in the Indo-Pacific. I want to remind you firstly, for Japan's security and prosperity, the US-Japan alliance is a cornerstone for sure. As the security environment surrounding Japan rapidly worsened, strengthening alliance and enhancing its deterrence posture are much more needed and much more imminent. To this end, the Japanese government repeatedly expressed its resolve to invest more resources to bolster its defense capability. And also now Japanese government is revising the 2013 National Security Strategy and other defense-related documents to be finished in the end of this year. But this alone is not enough. To ensure national security, we need stability in the region, especially given Chinese behavior becoming more assertive and the issue to be addressed more diverse. That's why the successive Japanese governments promote the vision of free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. And through this vision, Japan has increasingly recognized the need for multi-layered security cooperation with like-minded countries. So Japan has been expanding security cooperation not only with its neighbor, Australia and India, but also with the European countries, especially France and the UK, which have historical link with this region and possess power projection capabilities. So from Tokyo's perspective, such security cooperation with partners is a complement to the alliance with the United States, not a substitute for it. And the last month, the US-Japan 2+2 meeting was held, and their joint statement wrote down, I quote, "Four ministers welcome greater engagement in the Indo-Pacific by European partners and allies, including the UK, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, as well as through the EU and NATO, and expressed support for their expanded multilateral exercise and deployment." I think this sentence is quite interesting because for the very first time, European military contribution in this region appears in our joint statement, which means the US also basically welcomes such move by Japan and Europe. So now, what is the driving force of European increasing strategic interest in the Indo-Pacific? Of course, each country has a different background and different factor. For example, as you well know, France has overseas territories, more than 1.6 million French citizens, and vast exclusive economic zone in this region. So naturally for France, protecting these sovereign interests is #1 objective. And this rationale is unique to France as a resident power. As for the UK, it is often argued its Indo-Pacific tilt is not unrelated to Brexit. So each country has its own reason for doing so. But at the same time, we can find out common rationale of European enhanced commitment. This is like this. On one hand, the economic center of gravity is moving toward Indo-Pacific, and here is a center for global growth. But on the other hand, the strategic environment is unstable and uncertain, mainly due to Chinese assertive behavior, the relative decline of US power, and the growing US-China competition, and so on. Moreover, security situation in Europe and Asia are now well connected. So what happened in Asia have serious impact on Europe directly and vice versa. Therefore, for Europe, how to stabilize the Indo-Pacific region has become much more essential. And one way to achieve it is through military engagement. Now I'm moving to second section of my presentation. How does Japan view growing European military engagement in this region? First of all, I would like to point out that last year, 2021, was a very significant year because European military engagement attracted so much attention here in Japan. If I may speak from my personal experience, last year I had more opportunity to explain on this particular topic on radio, TV, and newspaper. Of course, over the past few years, it was known to Japanese experts that France and the UK had been sending naval vessels to the region. But in my impression, last year, many Japanese media outlets covered European military engagement more than ever, and the public attention or interest seemed to have increased. I think there are at least three factors explaining this phenomenon. The first one is that more European countries join sending warship to this region in a row. As is mentioned, traditionally France and UK had dispatched vessels in this region, but last year, in addition to UK and France stepping up their engagement, Germany and Netherlands were on board. So we saw more frequent visit and more visible European presence in this theater. And the second factor is that if we look at the program of joint military exercise, they are much become more practical and substantial, and the objective are becoming more clearer. Take just one example. Last May, with French Army and US Marine Corps, Japanese ground forces hold first ever joint military exercise on Japanese land to simulate regaining control of remote island from enemy forces. And what is important is that not only France take part in ground military exercise in Japan for the first time, but also Japan and France conducted more often multilateral high-end exercise with the United States, Australia, and India. And third and last point is that context didn't matter. I think last year we talked a lot about Taiwan. Also here in Japan, there have been much discussion about the likelihood of Taiwan contingency, how it would affect Japan, and how to deter it. Under such circumstances, Japan needs more partners sharing its fundamental value in order to uphold international principle. In this context, more Japanese may have tried to find meaning in European enhanced presence. So now I want to tell you Japanese on it. Unfortunately, we don't have public opinion data, so I did a quick survey of last year's editorial in some Japanese newspaper. Interestingly, all the papers took up the European engagement-related issue at least once, and the conservative-leaning papers such as Yomiuri and Niquet have covered it 5 times a year. And more importantly, what many in common is that basically welcome Europe's tilt and emphasize the need for Japan and Europe to work together to stabilize the region. For example, Yomiuri editorial January last year wrote, I quote, Japan should utilize the growing involvement of major European countries to help stabilize the area. And it repeated the same thing just after the UK announced Indo-Pacific tilt last March. And the Nikkei major economic paper also reiterated the importance of Japan's cooperation with European countries, EU, and NATO for regional stability. Of course, some newspapers on liberal camp are somehow wary of European military engagement while welcoming its engagement in general. For example, Asahi newspaper claim, I quote, "The objective of Japan-European security cooperation should not be tightening the noose around China's neck. It should be aimed at contributing to the regional peace and stability." So most media interpret European engagement in general in a positive light, but when it comes to the military engagement, each has slightly different nuance in its assessment. Lastly, I'd like to conclude my presentation by pointing some challenges. I personally welcome European strategic engagement and the EU's intention to enhance naval presence, which is mentioned in EU's Indo-Pacific strategy set in last September. But frankly speaking, among experts, there is an argument that European security commitment will not make much difference in the face of Chinese power. It might be the case in light of purely military balance of power, but still Japan and Europe need to send strong signal to uphold international principles such as freedom of navigation by action. So given Beijing's strong reaction to European activity here, such strategic communication in peacetime seems to be working well so far. But at the same time, we need to face the reality or biggest challenge, that is the lack of resources. With limited defense resources, Japan, European countries, and also the United States all cannot afford. So current crisis in Ukraine and Europe put Russia back on the top of the transatlantic agenda. So it's very natural that some European countries may want to much focus on Russia rather than Indo-Pacific or China. Then how Europe or EU's security engagement in this region would be? Is it going to be stable or not? So how to keep momentum after publication of EU Indo-Pacific strategy is key challenge for most strongest supporters like France, currently under the presidency of EU Council. And yes, I think prioritization is needed, but it is also difficult, not only for Europe, but also for Japan and for United States, because as I mentioned, security situation in Asia and Europe are much more linked. So in this regard, Japan, Europe, and the other like-minded partners such as Australia and India need more strategic dialogue from inter-theater perspective. So they also need to coordinate their operations such as exercise and training and capacity building more effective way. So related to this point, I think Japan's closely watching Franco-Australian relations after the AUKUS crisis. French fury over the AUKUS deal is totally understandable, but if unhealthy relationship will continue in the long run, it certainly has a negative impact on security cooperation at the field level, not only between France and Australia, but also multilateral cooperation, including Japan. So I wonder how both countries, France and Australia, would overcome the current situation and move forward. And lastly, I want to point out challenge on Japanese side. I think Japan should have a clearer strategy on security cooperation with Europe. Dr. Michito Tsuruoka, a well-known scholar on Japan-European relations, pointed out in his article last March, I quote, "With lack of strategy, Tokyo tends to be reactive rather than putting forward its own initiative, sometimes leaving the British and the French counterparts wondering what Japan want to do." I totally agree with his analysis and his conclusion. As I mentioned in the beginning, now Japanese government is revising national security strategy. So I hope Japan should take this opportunity to present a coherent and concrete policy guideline on security cooperation with like-minded countries, of course, including Europe, EU, and NATO. I will stop here and thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to discussion with you.
Thank you very much for this extremely interesting, candid, and very wide presentation. And now I will give the floor to Frédéric Grare to not only to answer, but to give his own analysis on this issue. Please, Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Valérie. Thank you for having me here. And thank you very much, Dr. Goroku, for a very interesting and balanced presentation, I must say. The problem that I have in trying to respond to you is that I agree with most of your analysis. I agree on the diagnostic, the need for better stability, the need for a geo-economic shift towards the Indo-Pacific, and the kind of hierarchy of the relationship that you establish, which is quite normal and so on. So I'm going to try to focus on perhaps where you left off, which is the challenges. I mean, you said that there is an argument in Japan that European security commitment will not make much difference. And I just think, honestly, that this is a legitimate argument, especially if we focus exclusively on the military side of it. Yes, there is more European involvement. Yes, it is something which has traditionally been carried out by the UK and perhaps more importantly France, at least in the past few years, because as you said rightly, are the territories and population in the Indo-Pacific, including the economic zone and so on. What the news is, and that's probably good news for us all, is that this is getting noticed now because this will undoubtedly facilitate cooperation. But the truth is, yes, in terms of strict capability, the European may not have much to bring to the Pacific, and even the German and Dutch cooperation may not be in a position added to the British and French position to balancing. But I don't think that this is where the strength of the European Union is. If you look at the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, what you see is something which vaguely looks like the addition of existing policies, vaguely rebranding and so on. The reality is that for the first time, Europe is looking at the Indo-Pacific in a very different way and trying to articulate and establish a hierarchy of its own interests. Now, one has to look at all those components, be it maritime security, be it ocean governance, be it trade, being connectivity and so on, in a very articulated way, because this is where the originality of the strategy is. This is not just a set of policies next to one another. This is policies which are put in a strategy in order to achieve an objective. You will notice that as cautious as the language may be, the political message is clear. This is about China, not necessarily in a systematically hostile way, but this is about China. And this is written black on white, and believe me, this has been an uphill battle in order to get there. The second thing is, it goes further than a strictly military approach. The Europeans are just too aware that their military capability to act decisively in the Indian Ocean first, in the Pacific next, are limited, and therefore are trying to act differently and including different manners. So when you see, for example, something like fisheries being included in maritime security, it means something, because this is a problem that you're faced with around the Senkaku Island. This is a problem that everybody in the South China Sea is faced with. This is a problem that is growing in the Indian Ocean, and therefore this is becoming a security issue. Same thing, there is a strategic dimension of climate change policies in this. There is a strategic dimension of ocean governance per se, even if the way to address them is not necessary through military means, on the contrary. But there we speak of capacities that the EU has. If we add the dimension that you spoke about on several occasions during your presentation, that is capacity building, there we have a plan of action which in effect has the possibility to not make Europe everything to everybody, but be definitely useful and help constrain China in many ways, and in an objective which is not a confrontation with China, which is more likely to try to rebalance peacefully the relationship with China. As problematic as it may seem right now, there is no illusion on the European side as what to China is about and so on. So you may say, well, this is all fine, but I mean, we are just at the beginning of the process, and you're right on that. All policies will not evolve systematically at the same time, at the same pace. And this is a process from the long term. The question will be, of course, are we facing precisely a pace problem? Are we too slow? And so on. But I mean, if you look at the pace at which things evolved since, let's say, 2018 and now, this is quite unprecedented for the EU. There are questions also that could be asked slightly differently. What is the nature of the strategic landscape that we are facing today? I mean, this is not all about military at all. The military is still and will remain a very important dimension of this all, and there is no question about that. But this is a strategic landscape in which each and every activity is systematically weaponized, in particular by China. So the question that I have, and perhaps one of the critics that you could have addressed to the European in a way, is are we doing enough in the field which are specifically or quite typically European strong points, such as trade or even connectivity, in order to really do something about the evolution of the situation? I'll start with the second point because here there is a ready-made answer, and this is the global gateway. The global gateway is, as you know, this project for connectivity all over the world, which has the stated objective of balancing China's BRI. Again, we're not talking of confrontation, we're talking of building influence by offering options to a set of countries which, deprived of the option, would be tempted to turn to China and therefore increase Beijing leverage. There we are. This is not a perfect text, and we are just at the beginning of it. What I think would be useful, but you may differ on that, is to engage Europe very quickly and quite rapidly on this issue and see what we can do together, although we already have a connectivity partnership with Japan, but in order to see what concrete project we start working on in terms of cooperation, perhaps coordination more surely, simply because cooperation is time-consuming, budget-consuming, and very often doesn't produce the expected result. Coordination is something else, and perhaps in terms of, let's say, stabilization of the region, more effective given the reality of the resources. But this is an instrument which is there, which is at our disposal, and by our disposal, I mean our collective disposal, that we need to talk about with all the European allies and partners, Japan being, of course, one of them. The second is trade, and the other field is more open. We do, of course, have a strategic partnership with Japan, signed in July 2018, which says a number of things, and perhaps we do have an EPA with Japan, but the question is, are we really doing enough? And there I do have some questions which are partly hypothetical, to be very honest. We have followed carefully what has happened with the trade regional arrangements in the Indo-Pacific. We have followed the role played by China in the RCEP. we have been following, of course, the sort of counter agreement that the CPTPP is. And there I do have some questions. There is something, I do understand why Japan, for example, welcomed the UK as becoming a member of the CPTPP. But also it's a very hypothetical question at this stage because nobody is really asking for it. What would be Japan's reaction to European demand for accession to the CPTPP? I mean, this is not just all about trade, and we all know it. This is about diversion of commerce. This is about forging strategic alliances and making sure that we, in effect, diminish the role of China, both tactically and in the global outcome. Tactically, because that will stop China from interacting on a strictly bilateral level with a number of countries with which the asymmetry of power systematically played in its favor. The second one is the global outcome, that's an agreement and a set of partners that would definitely protect themselves from this incursion. In other words, that would be nothing else than a huge diversification of trade and a lessening of China's influence. There, I haven't heard much about Japan's potential reaction to a potential demand, but that's something I think is worth exploring. Because I think that this is where, this is almost part of the DNA of the EU, and this is something that we could do. So I will stop here again, not because, I mean, I'm sure that we will have a lot to say in the discussion itself. I think that this non-military aspect of security are perhaps as interesting and certainly more promising if we speak of a Japan-European dialogue. And I'll stop on that and listen to your reaction to my question.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. So before I will relay questions from the floor, maybe Tsuyoshi Goroku, you may want to just tackle very briefly that question of the possible reaction of Japan if the EU were to be interested in joining the CPTPP. I know that some Japanese are experts among friends are discussing the possibility, and some say it will be a welcome evolution. But do you have to say something to say about the status of the debate on this particular point in Japan today?
Thank you. Thank you for the question about the possible European accession to CPTPP, right?
Yes.
Well, actually, I'm not particularly economic expert or trade expert, so I'm not following the discussion. But I don't think there is much discussion on the possible European accession to this frame. But of course, Europe and EU and Japan share the value on the economic side. Of course, liberal market and the free trade. So in the case of the Europeans' interest in CPTPP, well, it's surprising, but still it stimulates the discussion in Japanese society. And as for the UK's accession to CPTPP, in my impression, Japanese side welcome this accession, and of course negotiation is still underway. So maybe it may be difficult to conclude in a short term, but still it's important to have same framework between the countries sharing the value, including free and liberal economy.
Thank you very much. As Frédéric mentioned, of course, we all know that CPTPP is not only about economic it's not only the economic dimension that is important, but also, of course, the strategic dimension in relation with China and the posture we have vis-a-vis China. And when you mention, yes, in Japan, many people are interested in the candidacy by the UK to CPTPP, including because it would, according to some experts I talked to in Japan, it would reinforce the side of the liberal democracies versus China, with also a candidate and Taiwan. And of course, all this is very, you know, it's not for tomorrow, certainly not for China, but still the debate is about what side should be the stronger inside CPTPP. And of course, for Japan, the most important point would be for the US to come back to CPTPP, and they do not seem to be ready to do that. So they have their own kind of project regarding economic organization in the region. So there is a kind of proliferation of candidacies and, you know, format. And after all, if the CPTPP, we were joking about that with Frédéric Grare a few weeks ago, if CPTPP enlarges so much as to you know, with the European Union, the UK, China, and so on, so very nearly it will become as wide as the World Trade Organization, sorry. So it's a constant enlargement. I have another question from the floor to you about relationship between China and Japan. And I will read the question by Dr. Monica Chonsoya, who is both a friend and a colleague at GIA in Tokyo here. And she writes, China is increasingly questioning the US-Japan alliance and of Japan's continuing vitality in America's core cycle. What are your views on Japan still being America's first-tier ally? You mentioned the Japan-US alliance as the core element of stability and security in the Asia-Pacific. Is this alliance still you know, extremely strong? Or we could enlarge the question by tackling the question of reassurance, which is also asked by some US allies in Europe, by the way. So mostly about Japan-US alliances, the way it is seen in Japan on the question of reassurance with the US role in the region.
Thank you very much, Monica. Thank you for the question. It's very interesting. Yes, as you mentioned, China is questioning the relevancy of US-Japan alliance, but I think this is their playbook always, like Soviet Union and like Russia current days. So I think Japan is always being the American first-tier ally, but it's really in near future, it really depends on how Japan invests defense resource to bolster its defense and deterrence capability. So without this effort, I don't think America recognizes Japan as its first-tier ally. But geographically, I think US-Japan alliance is, whether you like or not, it's a cornerstone, not only for Japan's security and its prosperity, but also regional security. So in this sense, I think US-Japan alliance is much more needed, not only for Japan, but also for the regional stability. And the questioning on the America's credibility, it is true that after 4 years turbulence during the Trump presidency, we really expected Biden, Biden administration try to make effort to repairing the relationship with the ally, not only with the not only with Japan, but also with the NATO European countries. But 1 year has passed. I think, well, of course, they try to, emphasize the importance of the alliance, but, how to deal with the ally is much more questionable. For example, as French know very well, how to proceed the AUKUS negotiation is questionable not only for France but also from Japanese perspective, and also sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan is very shocking, not only for Europe but also for Japan. And now we are closely watching the Ukrainian crisis in Europe, and in Japanese society we discuss a lot because how this crisis have impact on the security situation in Asia. I personally don't think China and Russia simultaneously attacked either Ukraine or either Taiwan, but still how to respond to the Ukrainian crisis has a huge impact on what would happening in Indo-Pacific. So if America's reaction too soft or too weak, and they cannot deter the Russia's movement into the Ukraine, then maybe the American credibility from Japan's and the other European allies' perception is declining. But we are facing the dilemma because from Japanese perspective, if Americans are too much committed on Europe, if they will be busy on European business, which means that they cannot pay attention much more on the Indo-Pacific area. So this is a problematic for Japan. So we are facing dilemmas. How to balance these regional issue is, I think, we have to face in common.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to, please do not hesitate to ask questions using the Q&A button or comments. And meanwhile, Frédéric, do you want to add anything about what Tsuyoshi just said concerning that issue, not only of Japan-US alliance, but also the role of the US? Because of course, all our discussion is also one of the most important factor is the role of the US and also the positioning regarding, for instance, my impression here in Tokyo among some experts is that why they are so focused on the UK's role in the Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific. Of course, there are historical reasons between the UK and Japan, but also because to some experts, or particularly the one focusing more on the US, of course, a great advantage of the UK, and it's a traditional argument, is that the UK is, in their view, the closest ally of the US in Europe, and it's much safer for Japan to be closer to the UK than to countries like France, for instance, with their strange concept of strategic autonomy that some interpret as a direct criticism or going away from the role of the US, both in Europe or in the Indo-Pacific. So this is a much broader question. Do you have something to add to that, Frédéric? I do not hear you.
I said I certainly have something to add to that. But first of all, let me say that I agree with the analysis of Dr. Goroku, except perhaps one point, because I don't think that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is actually so important in real terms. It does look bad optically, but this is the realization of something that had been announced a long time ago, as early as 2009 with Obama, and which finally materialized in 2021. So that kind of thing at the very end of the process never looked good, but I don't think should be interpreted as a sign of weakness in any kind. AUKUS brings about a different story, and this is very much linked to the question that you raised, Valérie, about the proximity with the US, as the reassuring character of the proximity with the US, the question of strategic autonomy, and so on. I think that both in the US and in many countries, there is some of a complete misreading of, for example, the French position. What did shock the French in AUKUS, besides, of course, the contract per se, but the contract is only one negative aspect and not necessarily the most important one, is that this came against France when France was doing exactly the opposite, working exactly in the direction that US government was willing France to go, establishing a set of partnership within the ambit of the transatlantic alliance. You know, France had established very strong relation with India. Saudi had established very strong relation with Australia, had established partnership with Japan, and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, one of the pillars of this strategy was being weakened, if not almost suppressed. So yes, there was a shock and so on. And strategic autonomy never meant in the French mind strategic autarky, a willingness to get separated from the US. Quite the contrary. Even in the Australian contract, the US was very present through Lockheed Martin and so on. So what is it that we are trying to do that was against US interest and did affect US interest in any way? That's where the real shock came in. And that's why it created a serious breach of confidence between France and the US, France and Australia, definitely France and the UK, but that's a different story, and so on. But at the same time, there is one question which is left unanswered so far. What was the major problem in the Indo-Pacific beside China? The major problem in the Indo-Pacific beside China was the reliability of the US commitment to the security of the region. What we have seen with AUKUS, and which was in a way welcome, which was a reassertion of US military engagement in the region. Fine. What we didn't see is any additional guarantee of the sustainability of this engagement. Not that I'm suggesting in any way that this administration is willing to disengage or anything. This is not my point. But I mean, we all know about US growing political instability and what it means over time. So the question which were Japan's question just as much as European questions and so on are still very much unanswered. The country which went into AUKUS, which by the way is not a treaty, simply a series of technical arrangements, and we don't even know what the final outcome will be, but nevertheless, have decided in a way to forego their own sovereignty and completely align with the US. Did they get any additional guarantee? That's a slightly different question. And I'm not answering yes or no. I'm just saying this is a question, and I believe a legitimate question. So that's where we stand right now. Proximity with the US, well, we never went away from the US. Guarantees for the US, I don't know. What is sure, and I certainly agree with your analysis on that, the current situation is, in a sense, a test of what we will see in the future. As you said, we are faced with a dilemma. Too much weakness on the Russian front will send a wrong signal in the Indo-Pacific. But I mean, too much commitment to the Russia front will also divert resources from the Indo-Pacific. We understand that full well. And probably in France more than anywhere else, because as you rightly said earlier, we do have territories and population in the area. And this is not just a nice diplomatic thing or military thing to do. This is a need, because we need to protect those territories and population. That's period. So that's where we stand right now, and that's how I would answer to your question, Valérie.
Okay, so now I have a more specific question concerning, this is one of the mantra of both Japan's foreign policy, but also at the core of the EU, what EU is. very existence. It's a question of values or shared values or democratic norms. And David Cameron is asking a very difficult question, which is, how about Japan-EU initiative to try to restore democracy in Myanmar, to try to provide an opportunity to put into practice that concept of shared values that is very often brandished both by Japan and the EU. So this is a practical case where we know it's extremely difficult, but what about Japan and the EU on this question, on this issue? Tsuyoshi, if you have maybe something to say about that very quickly. I know this is not maybe your field of expertise, but still, the concept of shared values is a very important one for Japan. So what to do in the case of Myanmar? And this is a question of course, also for countries like France. Just recently, Total, a French company, decided to leave Myanmar, but it was not an easy decision to take.
Thank you very much for the important question and the difficult question to address, because as you know, Japan is a notorious famous for the human rights issue. Actually, now there is a heated debate on how Japan reacted to human rights abuse outside Japan, for example, like in China and Myanmar and Russia. And well, of course, there is a strong supporter who should introduce the legislation like Global Magnitsky Act, which is which has been introduced by European Union and the other countries like Canada and the other like-minded partner, which Japan doesn't have. But I think, in my understanding, Japanese government is very reluctant to take this question. I don't know why. I personally are strong for to introduce legislation to enable sanction over human rights abuse, with according with the other like-minded countries. But the reality is, very reluctant. So yes, it's in the near short term, it's difficult to exact measure to solve the problem in Myanmar between the EU and Japan.
Thank you very much. I think that recently the Japanese government nominated a special counselor, advisor for human rights. So we will see what may happen after this nomination on an increasing. I know that there is a debate in Japan on this issue. Indeed, it's very difficult, and it, like with relation with China, China is a huge issue for Japan, including for the Senkaku Island issue. But also we know that there are, as for Europe, in that sense, Japan and Europe are very close, or countries in Europe like Germany. The economic dimension of relationship between Japan and China is also a very important factor. So on one side, you have the United States threats, Taiwan Strait, of course, the Senkaku Island issue with China, and a very assertive policy from China. On the other side, we have the COVID-19 crisis, a necessity to rebuild the economy, and a very, very strong dependency between Japan and China on the economic side. I have maybe a question for Frédéric about France. There will be an Inter-Ministerial forum on the Indo-Pacific on February 22 in France, in the context of the French Presidency of the European Union. And first, what could we expect from that meeting? A more assertive approach on the European policy for Indo-Pacific? And also, what about, Australia has been invited finally There were question marks about it, but not China. So what would you say about what to expect of that kind of meeting, and what the decision not to invite China would have, what kind of consequences it may imply?
I don't think it will have any consequences, because it would have been a complete nonsense to invite China. It would have been a complete nonsense to invite China because, as I said earlier, the Indo-Pacific strategy everywhere in the world is about China and managing the rise of China. This is not about making sure that China get even more influent in any forum of any consequence. And this is not something confrontational. This is just the reality that we have serious conflict of interest, and that the Indo-Pacific strategy was meant precisely because of those major conflict of interest. So the non-invitation of China makes eminent sense in that context. What should we expect from the forum? I don't have the details. As you said earlier, I no longer work for the French MEA. But I would say three things, basically. A further appropriation of the Indo-Pacific concept by the Europeans themselves. I mean, the Europeans have gone a long way since the relief of the strategy in appropriating this concept. And yet, clearly, and for very understandable reasons, your perspective on it depends from where you sit. So if you are a Central European power, you're not necessarily seeing the Indo-Pacific as you see it from Paris and so on. And that's purely understandable. The second thing is making our Indo-Pacific partners realize that Europe is serious about the Indo-Pacific, that there is a real commitment. And third, perhaps the adoption of a few concrete projects that will precisely signal that the Indo-Pacific is not just word in the EU. That's one of the main objectives of the forum. I'm not saying that those, initiatives will necessarily be spectacular or will be encompassing the entire reality of the Indo-Pacific. Certainly not. Again, this is a project that will develop over time. This is a long-term endeavor, but at least we need to start somewhere and send signal that we mean business when we talk about Indo-Pacific in Europe. And that's, I think, the three major objectives that the forum will pursue.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. And I have a last question, as we have only 3 minutes left, to Tsuyoshi Goroku, about, according to Japanese perceptions, how do they evaluate in Japan the similarities and the differences between the Ukrainian and the Taiwanese cases? You mentioned it a little bit before, particularly considering what the US would or could or should do in both cases.
Thank you very much for a very interesting question and the important question, I think. If we compare the case with Taiwan and also Ukraine, I think both country as a region, whatever, has a distinct future, because Ukraine is not member country of NATO. So it's not, the Article 5 is not applied to Ukraine. But in Taiwanese case, of course, US is not officially ally of Taiwan, but still there is a Taiwanese act in the domestic politics. So, US has taken ambiguous policy, ambiguous stance vis-a-vis Taiwan. So China calculate it might be helping to Taiwan in case of the aggression. So this is, I think, big difference. And the one other difference is on the other hand, Ukraine is a sovereign and independent country for 30 years. But on the other hand, Taiwan will, you know, as for the diplomatic relationship, much country doesn't have Taiwan such a diplomatic relationship. So, you know, in Ukrainian case, what is at stake is territorial integrity and sovereignty. So how to respond to that question, I mean, Ukrainian question, is important not only for Ukraine territorial integrity and sovereignty, but also for entire Europe, but also for the Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we reach the end of that webinar. Thank you to both of you and to the people who joined us from Europe or from Japan. And the webinar will be put online on the podcast, as a podcast on the FRS YouTube channel in a few days. So thank you again. And have a nice day and a nice week. And let us meet again for the next FRS webinar or web conference, but will take place in March next month. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.